All right, my fine friends, welcome back. We have added all of what will be the scales are now covered in beeswax. And if anybody was wondering why we use beeswax specifically, it's because it's good and sticky and it sticks to eggshells, and other kinds of wax don't stick to eggshells. So do not try this with paraffin wax. It'll just peel right off once you try to do anything interesting or submerge it in dye or anything else. So the next thing that is going to happen is I'm going to start etching this. Now, because this is a large shell and it is empty, when you put it in liquid, like for instance vinegar, it'll float. So what you certainly can do is then weight it down. That's what I usually do if I'm working with a small egg and I'm putting that in a jar of dye. I just hold it down with one of these guys, which is it's one of those things that goes in a pegboard, except that it's been coated in tool dip so that it doesn't scratch up eggs with the business end. But these are not enough to hold down something this big. So I do something that is certainly not necessary, and I think most other people probably don't do it because it's annoying. But I am going to, I'm gonna fill this up with sand, craft sand specifically. I'll also throw in some BBs once I've got a little sand in there to protect the shell. And the advantage of the sand is that I can pour it back out once I'm done. I can keep reusing it. It doesn't go bad, it doesn't make a mess. You know, there's a little bit of dust at the end that comes out pretty easy. But the annoying part is that then I do, of course, have to put it in there, and then I have to take it out afterwards, and that's obnoxious. I have tried a few other methods. There are people who say you can just fill it up with water. I have not had good luck with that. I found that the temperature differential tends to leave the water, or the wax just tends to pop right off. So the beeswax is good and sticky, but even good sticky beeswax is not always enough. The stickiness won't always survive etching, particularly because I'm going to be leaving it in the acid for hours. So it's very important that the wax has a good grip on the eggshell and that it stays onto the eggshell. I will be checking as I etch it. I'll put it in there for about a half an hour, and then I'll get out a toothbrush and I'll give it a nice little scrub under some warm water. I will heat up my my vinegar just a little bit, just a touch in the microwave before I get started, so that it's not cold. If you put an egg with wax on it, if you put it in very cold water, that will frequently just pop the wax off, that temperature differential. If you put it in really warm water, it'll melt the wax. That's also not great. So it's important to get it just right. Now again, this step is not necessary. This step is something that I do because what I do worry about once I get down to, especially as I etch longer and deeper and I etch away more and more of the shell, I do get concerned that anything that's heavy enough to weigh the egg down in the acid might also be heavy enough to crack it. Never had it happen. It's just something I worry about. Ooh, I made a mess. And that's okay. Because again, most of this outer shell will just, is gonna get etched away in vinegar. Maybe I should have put down a older one of these just to keep it from getting mushy. Right. Few BBs in there. Oh, just do them that way, huh? The little funnel just makes life easier. It's not quite small enough to fit inside the hole, and I do have a even smaller one. It's great, but the BBs obviously don't fit through this one. The BBs fit through this one, but only if you don't get them jammed in there. Okay. Sorry, BBs. Try this again. bet when you looked up Bosanki eggs on YouTube, you didn't think you were going to be seeing somebody shoving BBs into an emu eggshell, right? But you are. It really seems like they should fit through, but only like one at a time. Okay, fine. And you might notice if you're looking real careful that my BBs are rusty. They're rusty because they've spent a lot of time inside eggshells that are submerged in vinegar. So I use these in emus, Rias, if I'm going to do a lot of etching. You know, not if I'm just dyeing it. There's really absolutely no point in doing this obnoxious step unless you're going to be submerging it in a liquid like vinegar for hours. Yeah, jeez. That's what they say about art, 90% perspiration. There's part of the 90%. Come on. There we go. Good. And the craft sand is great for just filling it up. What the BBs do is that they add more weight, so I don't have to fill it completely. Do not attempt to use rice. It's too light. And as it takes on liquid from the vinegar, it will swell, clog up your egg, and it'll never come out. Also, do not attempt to use melted wax, including paraffin or soy wax. You'd think you'd just be able to melt it right out when you're done. It doesn't melt right out when you're done. And if you leave it in a warm oven, let's say around like 175 degrees, which is totally warm enough to melt your wax, right? It's totally warm enough to melt your wax off when you're done working on an egg. But if you leave it in there too long, the eggshells do kind of cook, and then they get weaker. Because I think I did that with one emu egg that I was turning into a dragon egg. I filled it with paraffin wax, which wasn't really heavy enough to make a good difference anyways, so it didn't accomplish what I needed, which was to make it sink in vinegar. Didn't do what I wanted, and then when I tried to melt it out, melted wax came out, melted wax came out, melted wax came out. There was still melted wax inside. Couldn't get all the melted wax out. And then I picked up the egg and it just crunched. It had just gotten too brittle from all the heat. So don't do that. Learn from my mistakes. Water seems like a good idea. Might pop your wax off. Get your vinegar to a nice room temperature, slightly warmer than room temperature. You know, not hot enough to melt the wax, but warm enough that it feels comfortable on your skin. And then, once again, your wax is less likely to pop off. Now, if you don't mind toxic fumes, you don't need to use vinegar. You can use a stronger acid. The thing about eggshells is that they are basically calcium, which is a base, so they are basic, chemically speaking. And when exposed to an acid, that calcium will bubble off and it will eventually dissolve. And it will dissolve away. We call that etching. So any acid will do that. I like working with acetic acid. Acetic acid is vinegar. And sometimes you can find like 10% vinegar or 20% vinegar or 30% vinegar. Table vinegar, or the vinegar that you get at the store, is usually 4 or 5%. So obviously the stronger it is, the faster it'll work. but also the stronger it is, the more dangerous it is to inhale it, the harder it is on your lungs, the harder it is on your eyes, your skin, anything else it might come in contact with. Your stainless steel sink, porcelain. No, porcelain is usually okay with, right? So what you can also use if you want to go faster, if you don't mind the fumes, if you have a nice good respirator, or you're working outside, or you have great ventilation, or you just don't care about your lungs, you can use muriatic acid. Works real well. Muriatic acid is frequently found in toilet bowl cleaners. The older formulation of The Works toilet bowl cleaner, readily available at dollar stores across the U.S., was muriatic acid. Make sure you're reading your labels. You want it to be muriatic acid or it's not going to work. You don't want it to have any dyes or coloring. If it has dyes or coloring, it's going to dye and color your eggshell while it's etching it. Or you can just go with super strong acetic acid. You can also buy citric acid, aka vitamin C. So if you look for vitamin C powder, it's very inexpensive. You can buy it in bulk usually. You can mix that in with your vinegar to raise the acid content. Raise the pH also. No, lower the pH. To lower the pH, which makes it more acidic. Right. I remember basic high school chemistry. So these are other things you can do. I don't mind spending more time having it just sit in the vinegar and then being able to use 5% vinegar and using no special PPE. I don't need to use a respirator. I do use gloves just because, you know, if you have a little paper cut and you get some vinegar on your paper cut, it really hurts. Nobody likes that. I get a lot of paper cuts at work. It's an occupational hazard. Bloop. So I do wear gloves, but I'm just wearing like nitrile gloves, nitrile. Nothing heavy duty. If you're going to work with muriatic acid, you should definitely invest in some acid resistant gloves. I think the thick black ones are usually acid resistant, but they'll say on the label. If you're looking at PPE, or at sites that carry PPE, or at stores that carry PPE, they're going to know what's acid resistant and what is not. Acid resistant is going to be very, very, very important when you're working with acid. I know, isn't that smart? Okay. Right, that's good and heavy. So now that that's good and heavy, there's still plenty of air in here, so it still is not going to, it'll still float a little bit, but that's okay because now it will stay a little bit further down in the acid without me having to hold it down quite so much. Okay, now we're going to come back and put our plug back in. Yes, I plugged it and then I unplugged it and now I'm plugging it again, and that seems a little ridiculous, and it maybe kind of is a little bit ridiculous. I probably didn't need to plug it for the initial dye because, you know, you get a little bit of dye in your egg, you get a little bit of dye in your egg, but it only takes a few seconds, so here we are. But again, we want to make sure that I'm getting a nice good seal, so first get some fresh wax around there because I roughed it up quite a bit with the funnel. Lovely. Got my slightly warm wax plug. Bloop. 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 Seal that up. I do love the beeswax candles. The smell of the beeswax is so yummy. I sometimes feel a little bit guilty using as much beeswax as I do. Beeswax is sort of a precious commodity. It's something like, oh gosh, I forget the amount, but it's something like 4 pounds of honey that it takes to make an ounce of beeswax, or something obscene. It's a lot of effort for the bees to make the beeswax. But but nothing else is going to stick to your eggs like beeswax. So really, it is worth it to make sure that you have pure beeswax. And then if you're doing fine work, you want to make sure that it is filtered at least 3 times. When you're doing thick work like this with a Kiska, I mean like with a manual, you know, it only needs to be filtered a couple times because there's smuts in there. I mean, you can see the soot and the schmutz because I have a dirty Kiska. And Karen Hanlon would not be pleased at how filthy and dirty my Kiska is, because I am not a good Ukrainian girl who keeps her Kiski clean. I mean, I clean them. I don't live in filth. But for this work, they get pretty sooty. They get pretty sooty, but I'm just going to make sure that it's clear before I put it away to cool. So usually a good heat and a tap, and then I look through it and I can see light through the end, which is a good sign. If I couldn't, I've got a handy dandy wire on a stick. I can shove my wire through there and make sure. And if you're ever worried about losing your wires on sticks, magnets. Just put a magnet somewhere nearby. Like, I don't know, glue it to the side of your light. Works great. And then it's right at your hands whenever you need it. Okay, moving on.